The bar was dimly lit, the low hum of conversations blending with the clink of glasses and the scratch of a pool cue against felt. In the far corner, sitting with his back to the wall, was John Grayson, a man of few words and even fewer friends. The regulars called him the Colonel, though no one knew for sure if he'd ever held that rank. His weathered face told a story of years in battle, though no one dared to ask. John nursed his drink, his eyes scanning the room out of habit more than interest. He liked this bar, the anonymity, the quiet, but that was about to change. The door slammed open, and in walked a group of rowdy men, laughing too loudly, their voices booming through the room like thunder. John didn't flinch. He'd seen worse. But then one of them, a tall, muscular brute with tattoos snaking up his arms, locked eyes with John. He smirked. "Hey, old man," the brute called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "This ain't a retirement home. Maybe it's time for you to shuffle out of here before things get rough." John didn't respond. He took another sip of his drink, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass. The crowd was watching now, tension filling the air like a brewing storm. "Didn't you hear me?" the brute snarled, stepping closer. He shoved John's shoulder, but the veteran remained calm, still seated. His eyes, however, flickered with something dangerous. "Son," John said quietly, his voice steady, "you don't know what you've started." The brute laughed, but there was no humor in it. He had no idea what was coming next. The tension in the bar thickened as Derek, the tattooed brute, cracked his knuckles. His friends, a scruffy bunch with too much confidence and not enough sense, circled around, egging him on. John remained seated, his expression unchanged, but his mind was working, the soldier in him preparing for what was coming. Derek leaned down, putting his face inches from John's. The smell of alcohol on his breath was pungent, and his eyes gleamed with malice. "What's wrong, old man? Too scared to say anything?" The bar had gone silent. Every patron seemed frozen, eyes glued to the scene unfolding. No one dared to interfere. The bartender, wiping down a glass, had stopped mid-motion, watching the veteran with an expression of concern. John set his glass down carefully, the soft clink sounding louder in the quiet. "You've had your fun," he said calmly, his voice low but authoritative. "Now walk away." Derek straightened up, laughing. "Walk away? Oh, you've got some nerve. Maybe you don't understand what's happening here. I'm in charge now, old man." The group of men behind Derek chuckled, feeding off his bravado. They had no idea who they were dealing with. John's eyes met Derek's again, but this time there was a coldness to them. "You might want to reconsider," John said quietly. His words weren't a threat. They were a fact. But Derek wasn't the type to reconsider anything. With a quick, violent shove, he pushed John off his stool, sending the veteran sprawling onto the floor. The group erupted in laughter. "See?" Derek sneered, standing over John. "Not so tough now, are ye?" He didn't finish the sentence. With a speed that took everyone by surprise, John moved. He swept Derek's legs out from under him with a single, precise motion, sending the larger man crashing to the ground. In an instant, John was on his feet again, standing over Derek, his calm composure never faltering. Derek lay there, stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief. The bar was deadly silent, everyone in shock. John looked down at him, the briefest hint of a smirk crossing his face. "Son," John said, his voice still steady, "I've been through worse than you can imagine. Don't make me show you." The group of men surrounding Derek took a collective step back, their confidence wavering. They were starting to realize this wasn't going to go the way they thought. As Derek scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger, the memory of another time, another place, flashed before John's eyes. A battlefield, decades ago. A younger version of himself, standing tall in the chaos, giving orders, leading men through the smoke and fire. He had always been calm under pressure, a trait that had saved his life more than once. In the military, it was a necessity. Now, it was his weapon of choice. John blinked, bringing himself back to the present. The crowd in the bar was watching him now with a mix of awe and fear. But John didn't care about their stares. He only cared about making sure this didn't escalate further than it needed to. Derek, however, wasn't ready to back down. Embarrassment and bruised pride fueled his next move as he reached for a beer bottle on the bar, smashing it against the counter. John's eyes narrowed. He had dealt with men like Derek before, men who didn't know when to quit, but John wasn't about to let this get out of hand. With measured steps, John approached Derek, his gaze never leaving the broken bottle in the younger man's hand. "Put it down," John said, his voice calm but commanding. "You don't want this fight." Derek hesitated, glancing at his friends for support, but they were no longer laughing. The mood in the bar had shifted, and they were starting to realize that their leader had gotten them into something far more dangerous than a simple bar brawl. "Come on, man," one of Derek's friends muttered nervously. "Let's just go." But Derek's ego wouldn't let him back down. He lunged at John, the bottle swinging wildly. It was over in seconds. John sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, his movements fluid, like a soldier reacting in battle. He caught Derek's arm, twisting it behind his back, forcing him to drop the bottle. With one swift motion, John disarmed him completely, and Derek was on his knees, his face twisted in pain. The bar was silent once again, the patrons staring in disbelief. John released Derek, letting him slump to the floor. He stepped back, dusting off his hands, his expression as calm as it had been the entire time. "You should have listened," John said quietly. Derek didn't respond. He was too busy nursing his wounded pride. Just as things seemed to settle, one of Derek's friends, a lanky man with a mean streak, took a step forward, clearly not ready to let things go. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. "Just because you're a vet doesn't mean you get to walk around acting like you own the place." John turned his gaze to the man, his eyes cold and unreadable. "You don't want this," he warned again, his patience running thin. But the man, fueled by adrenaline and misplaced loyalty, charged at John with a roar. John reacted quickly, stepping aside and using the man's momentum against him. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man's arm and flipped him onto the bar floor. The man groaned in pain, clearly not expecting the veteran's swift and calculated response. The rest of the group, seeing their second man taken down so easily, began to back off, their confidence shaken. They were beginning to understand that John was not just another patron in the bar. They had picked a fight with someone far beyond their league. The bartender, sensing that things were about to get even more out of hand, quickly stepped in. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice firm but shaky. "This ends here." John nodded, taking a step back, but his eyes never left the group. They were cowed now, but they still hadn't learned their lesson. Derek, nursing his bruised ego and his twisted arm, slowly stood up, glaring at John. "This isn't over, old man," he hissed, his pride refusing to let him walk away without the last word. But John just smiled faintly, the hint of amusement in his eyes. "It never is." The group, now thoroughly disoriented and wary, lingered for a moment longer. Derek's face flushed red with humiliation, but his eyes burned with stubborn rage. He took one last look at John, sizing him up before stumbling back toward his friends, muttering curses under his breath. The rest of the patrons, sensing the danger had passed, exhaled in relief. The clatter of glasses and quiet conversations gradually returned to the bar, but the tension lingered in the air like a bad aftertaste. John, ever composed, returned to his seat at the bar, his eyes scanning the room once more, ever watchful. The bartender approached cautiously, setting down a fresh drink in front of him. "On the house," the bartender said, his voice low but filled with respect. John nodded in acknowledgement but didn't say a word. He wasn't here for free drinks or accolades. He was here to forget, for just a little while, the weight of the years, the loss, the battles long past but never forgotten. But just as John began to settle back into his quiet routine, the door swung open again, and a figure stepped into the bar. It was a man John recognized instantly, though he hadn't seen him in years. Lieutenant Jake Harrison, an old comrade, now a decorated officer in the local police force. His uniform gleamed under the dim bar lights, and his face was a mixture of surprise and amusement as he surveyed the scene before him. "Colonel," Jake greeted, using the old nickname the way only someone from John's past could. He approached with a slow, deliberate walk, his eyes flicking between John and the group of rowdy men still nursing their bruised egos in the corner. John's expression softened, though he didn't smile. "Lieutenant," he replied, the weight of years in his voice. Jake chuckled, but there was an edge to his tone. "I heard there was some trouble here. Couldn't believe it when I saw your name pop up in the report." John shrugged. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Jake's eyes lingered on the group in the corner. "I see that." He turned back to John, his voice dropping a notch. "But I have a feeling there's more to this story than just some drunk idiots picking a fight." John didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his drink, his mind drifting for a moment back to the old days. "There's always more to the story," he finally said. Jake pulled up a stool next to John, his presence both familiar and comforting, yet laced with the same tension that had haunted them both since the war. "You still can't walk into a bar without stirring up trouble, huh?" Jake quipped lightly, though his eyes were sharp, watching John carefully. John glanced over at Derek and his crew. They were still there, nursing their wounds, casting dark glances in his direction. "Wasn't looking for trouble," John said quietly. "But sometimes it finds you." Jake nodded in understanding. He knew better than anyone that trouble had a way of following men like them, no matter how hard they tried to leave it behind. "You all right?" Jake asked, though the question carried more weight than just a concern for John's physical well-being. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at his old friend, a man who had fought by his side in battles that seemed like a lifetime ago. "Just trying to keep moving forward," John replied, his voice low. "Same as always." Jake nodded again, but his attention was drawn to Derek, who was now standing, his hands clenched into fists, eyes burning with unresolved anger. "Looks like he's not done yet," Jake muttered, his tone darkening. Derek's steps were slow, deliberate, as he approached John and Jake. The bar patrons tensed once more, some even backing away from their tables as the confrontation loomed. "You think this is over, old man?" Derek growled, his voice low and venomous. "I ain't finished with you." John stayed seated, his calm demeanor unchanged, but Jake shifted, ready to step in if necessary. "Don't do this, kid," Jake warned, his hand resting on his holster. "You've already lost." But Derek wasn't listening. His pride wouldn't let him. "I'm not walking away from this," he shouted, drawing even more attention from the room. John sighed, turning to face Derek fully. "You've got nothing left to prove here," he said. "Walk away before it gets worse." But Derek sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero?" His voice was shaking with fury. "You think because you fought in some war that it makes you better than us?" John's eyes darkened, but his voice remained steady. "No, son, it doesn't make me better, but it means I've seen what happens when pride gets the best of a man, and it's never good." For a moment, something flickered in Derek's eyes, hesitation, maybe even doubt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He raised his fist, ready to strike. Before Derek could land his punch, Jake stood up, placing himself between the two men. His expression was hard, his voice full of authority. "Enough!" he barked. "This ends here." Derek froze, his fist still raised, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. The presence of an armed officer was enough to quell even the most foolish of men. He slowly lowered his arm, his chest heaving with frustration and humiliation. "You don't want to do this," Jake warned again, his voice quieter, but no less commanding. "Trust me." Derek stood there for a long moment, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. But eventually, the weight of the situation settled in. With one last glare at John, he spat on the floor and turned to leave, his friends trailing after him. As the door slammed shut behind them, the tension in the bar finally began to dissipate. People went back to their drinks, the whispers of the confrontation already starting to fade. Jake let out a long breath, shaking his head. "Kids, these days," he muttered. He turned back to John, his expression softening. "You all right?" John nodded. "I'm fine." Jake sat back down, the weight of the evening settling between them. For a moment, neither man spoke. They just sat there, two soldiers who had survived more than most could ever imagine, each lost in their own thoughts. "You ever think it'll stop?" Jake asked quietly, breaking the silence. John didn't have to ask what he meant. The nightmares, the memories, the ghosts of the past, they never really left. "No," John said softly, "but you learn to live with it." Jake nodded, his eyes distant. "Yeah, I guess you do." Just as John was preparing to leave, thinking the night's troubles were over, a voice called out from the other side of the bar. "Wait!" It was Derek. He hadn't left with the others. He stood in the doorway, his face still twisted with anger, but now there was something else in his eyes, something John hadn't seen before. "Why didn't you fight back?" Derek asked, his voice quieter, almost uncertain. "Why didn't you finish it?" John regarded him for a long moment, then stood up, his eyes never leaving Derek's. "Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones you fight with your fists." Derek stared at him, confused, but something in John's words had struck a chord. He didn't know what to say. He simply watched as John walked past him and out into the night, leaving the bar behind. The scene outside was quiet, the cool night air wrapping around John as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He glanced back at the bar, then up at the stars, letting the moment wash over him. There would always be battles. Some were fought in far-off lands, others in quiet bars, but they all left their marks. John knew this better than anyone. As he walked away, his mind drifted once more to the past, to the comrades he'd lost, and to the battles yet to come. But tonight, at least, he had won, not with violence, but with wisdom. John walked down the quiet street, the bar fading into the distance behind him. His steps were slow, measured, as if each one carried the weight of years gone by. The confrontation with Derek had stirred something deep inside him, memories he had long buried but never truly forgotten. The night was still, save for the occasional hum of a passing car or the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. John found himself walking without a destination, his mind drifting back to the battlefield. Not the physical one he had left behind, but the emotional one he carried with him every day. He could still hear the gunfire, the shouts of his comrades, the roar of helicopters overhead. But more than that, he could still feel the weight of responsibility. Leading men into combat, knowing that some of them wouldn't make it back, that was a burden no man could ever fully put down. John stopped at a park bench, its old wooden slats creaking slightly as he sat down. He stared ahead, seeing nothing, yet everything. Faces of fallen comrades flashed before his eyes, young men full of life, now just ghosts in his mind. A flash of guilt washed over him. He had survived, but so many hadn't. And for what? A life of quiet nights alone in bars, haunted by memories of wars that no longer mattered. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. John's instincts kicked in immediately. Decades of training had made him hyper-aware of his surroundings, even when lost in thought. He turned slightly, catching a glimpse of a figure coming toward him. It was Derek. John didn't flinch or react. He simply watched as the younger man hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the other end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, Derek broke the silence. "You didn't have to go easy on me back there." John didn't reply right away. He wasn't sure if Derek was looking for an apology, an explanation, or something else entirely. "I wasn't going easy," John said after a moment, his voice calm. "I was giving you a choice." Derek frowned, clearly confused. "A choice?" John nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty street ahead. "A choice between walking away with your pride intact or doing something you'd regret. It's not always about who can hit harder, kid. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not fight at all." Derek sat back, digesting John's words. For the first time, the anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by something more reflective. "I don't get it," he admitted, his voice softer now. I wanted to prove something, to show I wasn't weak." John glanced at him, his eyes softening. "And did you?" Derek shook his head, looking down at the ground. "No, I just made a fool of myself." John let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "I've been where you are," he said quietly, thinking that fighting would make me stronger, prove something to the world. But you learn after a while that strength isn't always about what you can do with your fists. Derek remained quiet, but John could see the wheels turning in his mind. There was more to this kid than just a bruised ego. The two sat in silence for a while longer, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Derek finally spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "My old man. He was a Marine. Used to tell me all these stories about how tough he was, how many fights he won. He made me feel like if I didn't live up to that, I was nothing." John nodded, understanding all too well. "And now, you feel like you've got to prove yourself to his memory." Derek looked at John, surprised. "How'd you know?" John smiled faintly. "Because I've seen it before. Young men trying to fill the shoes of fathers who weren't around, or who expected too much. It's a heavy burden to carry." Derek sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, it is." John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me tell you something about your old man, and every other soldier who's been through it. We didn't fight because we were strong. We fought because we had to, and most of us came out the other side weaker, not stronger." Derek's brow furrowed. "But all the stories, about bravery, honor, sacrifice." John nodded. "They're true, in their way, but they don't tell you about the parts that come after, the quiet nights when the ghosts come back, the moments when you doubt everything you did, everything you became. The bravest men I've known were the ones who came home and managed to live with it." Derek didn't say anything, but John could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was starting to understand. The night grew colder, but neither John nor Derek seemed to notice. They sat on that bench for what felt like hours, exchanging few words but sharing an understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Finally, Derek broke the silence again. "So, what now?" John stood, his joints creaking slightly as he rose. "That's up to you, kid. You've got a long life ahead of you, plenty of chances to make better choices." Derek looked up at him, uncertainty in his eyes. "And what about you?" John smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I keep moving forward. That's all any of us can do." He turned to leave, but Derek's voice stopped him. "Thanks." John paused, then nodded. "Take care of yourself, son." As John walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't often that he found someone who understood, someone who could see past the surface. Derek was just a kid trying to find his way, like so many others. Maybe tonight, John had helped him take his first step in the right direction. The next morning, John woke up feeling the weight of the previous night still pressing on him. He brewed a pot of coffee, staring out the window of his small, sparse apartment. His mind wandered back to the war, to the soldiers he had led, and to the kid in the bar who reminded him of the young men who used to look to him for guidance. It had been years since John had thought of himself as a leader, but last night, for the first time in a long time, he had felt that spark again. Not the soldier, not the warrior, but the mentor. There was a knock on the door, pulling him out of his thoughts. John opened it to find Jake standing there, holding a cup of coffee and a bag of donuts. "You mind if I come in?" Jake asked. John stepped aside, letting him in. The two men sat down at the small kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee filling the room. "So, about last night?" Jake began. John raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Jake chuckled. "You've still got it, Colonel. That kid didn't stand a chance." John shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Wasn't about winning." Jake nodded, understanding. "I know, but it was good to see you in action again. You've still got a lot to give, you know?" John glanced at him, curious. "What are you getting at?" Jake leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "There's a program I've been working on, for veterans. Guys like you and me who've got a lot of experience but maybe not a lot of direction after the service. We help mentor younger vets, help them transition into civilian life." John didn't say anything, but his interest was piqued. "You don't have to answer now," Jake continued. "But think about it. You've got a lot of wisdom, a lot of lessons to pass on. Guys like that kid from the bar, they need someone like you. John sat back, considering Jake's words. Maybe this was what he had been missing all along. A way to use his experiences, not to relive the past, but to help shape the future. "I'll think about it," John finally said. Jake smiled. "That's all I ask." As Jake left, John stared out the window again, the gears turning in his mind. Maybe his days of fighting were over, but his days of leading, of guiding, were just beginning. Weeks passed, and John Grayson found himself returning to the bar less frequently. The quiet nights that once helped him escape had been replaced by something new: purpose. He had taken Jake up on his offer to join the Veterans Mentorship Program, spending his days talking to younger men and women who were lost, much like Derek had been. Each conversation, each shared story, became another brick in the bridge between John's past and the present. Derek had also returned, this time not to fight, but to listen. He came to one of the mentoring sessions, his anger and pride replaced with curiosity and a new willingness to learn. John had been surprised at first, but seeing Derek take responsibility for his future had felt like a victory that meant more than any bar brawl ever could. One evening, after a long day of helping others, John sat at home with a sense of calm that had eluded him for years. He reflected on the road he'd traveled, the battles fought overseas, the struggles faced alone, and the unexpected twist of finding purpose again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John knew he'd never truly escape the ghosts of his past. But now he had found a way to live with them, to use his experiences not as burdens, but as tools to guide others. It wasn't the kind of mission he'd imagined for himself when he was young, but it was the one he had now, and in its own way, it was more important than any war he'd fought. With every person he helped, every life he touched, John felt a little more at peace. He'd come full circle. Not a broken veteran, but a man with something to give. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As John Grayson found his way to a new mission, there are countless veterans and individuals out there who also need someone to guide them, to show them that life after the battles can still have meaning. Whether you're a veteran, someone struggling with your own challenges, or someone who wants to make a difference, remember, you don't have to face it alone. If this story resonated with you, consider joining a local veteran support group, becoming a mentor, or simply reaching out to someone who might need your wisdom or help. Share your experiences, because they can change lives, just like John did. And if you want more stories of resilience, redemption, and the unexpected twists that life throws our way, make sure to subscribe and share this story. You never know who might need to hear it.